I'd like to welcome you all to Boğaziçi University and the second of Boğaziçi lectures, which we started as part of our 150-year celebrations. And these lectures will continue in the coming years with two lectures per year. In the beginning, when we started this out, we imagined Boğaziçi lectures to be opportunities where we get to hear leading scholars in their fields on topics they consider significant, be it history, literature, economic, social ideas, so any topic imaginable. We also see these lectures as a way of actually connecting or reconnecting with the public at large and remind people that as a university, one of our main tasks is to help disseminate ideas and discuss ideas, and we think this university is one of the best places we can do that. We also wanted as much variability about the topics discussed in those Boğaziçi lectures as possible. Some of you may remember that the first Boğaziçi lecture was delivered a couple of months ago by Craig Calhoun, a sociologist and director of the London School of Economics, and he talked about public mission of the universities. Today we have the honor of welcoming Professor Syzmanski, and he's going to talk about on economics of football. I think for beginners, that's a very good amount of variability in terms of topics. Again, when we planned this, I had a couple of wishes. One of them was to get Professor Syzmanski here to talk about it, and that actually happened. The other was to get people in the audience within the university, but also from outside the university. Sports media who think seriously about issues of sports and football, as well as members of the body governing football in Turkey, and members are here as well. So I thank them all for coming to this talk at Boğaziçi. Now, for our speaker, I think all of you know him, but Professor Stefan Syzmanski is a well-known and prolific sports economist. He is currently the Stephen J. Galetti Collegiate Professor of Sport Management at University of Michigan, Department of Kinesiology. He is also the co-director of Michigan Center for Sports Management. He received his BA undergraduate degree in politics, philosophy and economics from University of Oxford, and then his MA and PhD degrees in economics from University of London Birkbeck College. Since then, he worked as a faculty member at Imperial College London, Cass Business School at the University of London, and recently he moved to United States to University of Michigan. And his main interests, again, most of you are familiar with him, his main interests are sport management and economics, European sport, internationalization of sport, and governance of sport. He also is one of those academics who have big impact on real life. He has been an active consultant to private and public authorities, including UFA, Champions League, European Commission, on several issues ranging from sports funding to broadcast rights. And as I said, he is very prolific. His publications are too many to mention in detail, but I'll suffice it to say that he has more than 50 referred journal articles, 30 professional articles, around 20 chapters, and 8 books. I think one of his important characteristics to us is that he is also a true public intellectual, and he makes his science accessible to the general public. Of his many publications, I'm going to mention some of his books, which include Winners and Losers, The Business Strategy of Football with Tim Kuipers, National Pastime, How Americans Play Baseball and the Rest of the World Plays Soccer, Fans of the World Unite, A Capitalist Manifesto for Sports Consumers with Stephen Ross, Football Economics and Policy, The Comparative Economics of Sport. Last but certainly not the least, he is the co-author of Why England Lose and Other Curious Football Phenomena, also known as Soccernomics to some of us, and published as Futbolun Şifreleri in Turkish, co-authored with Simon Cooper. It's actually one of the most exciting books I've ever read, and personally I go back to different chapters over and over again, and you can find, as all of you I'm sure read the book, you can find beautiful data-based analyses and discussion of several issues related to sports, and more specifically to football, which include why soccer clubs don't make money and why they shouldn't make money, whether there is discrimination against black players and coaches, the country that loves the soccer most. It's not Turkey, by the way. And the best way to spend your money, it turns out, is to invest in foreign players' adaptation to the country where they are transferred. In one of the reviews of the book, a reviewer, Jack Grohl, summarized the book as the Barcelona of football books. Obviously, that was, I think he was referring to Barcelona of a couple of years ago, but still, I think he makes a fine point. And he said, if Barcelona is a team that represents all that is good on the football pitch, the cure to anti-football, then Cooper and Syzmanski are its unparalleled equivalent of the pitch. Rationalists whose critical approach to football deserves recognition. So without abusing your patience, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank Professor Syzmanski on behalf of the university, as well as myself, for taking the time to come over and talk to us. So I'd like to leave the floor to Professor Syzmanski.
Thank you very much, Ali, for that incredibly generous introduction, which now makes me feel terrible that I have something really big to live up to. So I shall do my best. It's a great honor to be invited here. Istanbul is one of my favorite cities on the planet. So when Ali asked me if I would come and talk, I jumped at the opportunity. It's always a great thrill to be here. And if you have read Soccernomics, and I don't know if you have, but if you have, you will also know from the introduction that this is the city in which Simon and I first hatched the plan to write the book in the first place. We were inspired. We were here at the for an anniversary of a football club here, and again, it's always troublesome when you start mentioning the names of clubs. For some people in this room, Fenerbahce is probably okay. Some people not so much. But in any case, it was the chance to come here that actually was the genesis of our book. So it's really a great honor to be here again and have a chance to talk to you. And also, of course, to be here for the 150th anniversary of this university, this great university with its enormous history. And there's a striking parallel for me as somebody who writes about football, because, of course, it's also in last year the 150th anniversary of the English Football Association, the first national football association on the planet. So there's the two things happened at the same time. And my talk today is really about relates to that in a way, because I'm going to talk to you not about club football, but about national team football. And I'm going to talk to you about competition between national teams. Of course, 1863, England creates the first football association, but there's a problem. If they want to have a national team, who are they going to play against? There's only one national football association. And of course, the story of football is largely the growth of national associations, the expansion of football. The first international game is played in 1872 between England and Scotland. And in the ensuing decades, more and more countries across the planet come to have football associations until, of course, now today, FIFA has, 208 member associations, and that generates an awful lot of competition. And of course, again, if you're here, I'm sure everyone in this room is really looking forward to this summer and the World Cup, to sit down and just watch lots and lots of football. And really my talk is about the competition between nations and how that competition is evolving, and to draw a parallel between that evolution and the economic development of competition between nations and comparisons between countries. And I want to start with a story, an event, something which I remember from my childhood, which, looking around the room, one or two of you may be old enough to remember this and may have seen this on television, but probably not most of you. And I'm actually going to I've actually got the event on video, so I'm going to show you the video of this event from the 1974 World Cup, a game between Brazil and Zaire. Okay, well, you can actually see this on YouTube. I strongly recommend you do go back and see this event. So this was an event during the game. So this was only the second time an African team had actually qualified for the World Cup finals. Right near the end of the game, Brazil were 3-0 up and coasting to victory. And Jairzinho and Rivellino, two of the great Brazilian players, were standing over a free kick that they'd been awarded just outside the Zaire penalty area. And the referee was organising the players and was just standing back to blow his whistle so that they could take the free kick. But when one of the Zaire players just ran up and kicked the ball far into the stands, which, since the referee hadn't blown the whistle, he was not entitled to do. And this incident was then seized upon by the media as being an example of African backwardness. It was kind of said, well, see, these Africans, they don't even know how to play the game, and the implication is they shouldn't really be here, and that somehow they would never be competitive in the world of international football. And of course, what's striking about that is how far African nations have progressed since then. The extent to which actually now we think of African nations in football as being serious competitors. Nobody would question their right to appear in these competitions, and they are thought to produce some of the best players in the world. So in my lifetime, at least, there's been a transformation in the perception of African football, and that perception is driven by the results that the team has achieved. So in some sense, they've got a lot better relative to the teams against which they compete. And my story today really is about how that process might occur, and particularly I'm interested in measuring statistically to what extent this process is occurring. So the word convergence refers in economics to the idea that those who are behind are likely to catch up with those who are in front. And so in football terms, we're thinking about convergence in terms of the quality, the results of the teams that have perhaps start out with a relatively poor performance, and whether they're converging and catching up with the rest of the teams. And I'm going to look at that in a number of different ways in this presentation. So, and I'm going to think about this question of catch-up, about whether other countries are catching up in terms of their football results against the leading teams. And I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look at that question in three different ways. The first way to look at this is to think about the two dominant federations in world football. So international football started off being played in Europe, and it spread first to South America. The continent outside of Europe which first started playing was South America, and the federations of Europe is UEFA, and South America is CONMEBOL. And so the question I'm going to look at is, to what extent are the results of teams from outside of those two federations doing better over time? And I'll show you some data to look at that. But then I want to look at it in a more specific kind of way, a more specific statistic that I want to look at, but which really applies more generally between teams in football, and that is to look at how current performance, or how changes in current performance, relate to past performance. So is it the case that teams that have been performing badly in the past are getting better, and teams that were performing well in the past are in some sense getting worse, are not as victorious as they once were? So I'm going to look at, and I'm going to show you some data, some statistics to look at that. And then finally I'm going to look at the dispersion of results of national teams. So look at the spread of results across all teams and say, is the spread getting narrower? So is there some sense, is the distribution of results, is this somewhat, in some sense, collapsing to maybe not to a single point, but to a very narrow range? So I'm going to show you different types of data to look at those, answer those three different questions. So here's an example. So my database concerns international football results, football team results, and I have data for all the results that are known going back to 1872. So it's a database of something like, I think, 35,000 results. Part of it relied on research done by a colleague from Cass Business School in London, a statistician who in his part-time made it his business to assemble a database of all international football games ever played. Something of a labour of love. And of course, in some sense, there's some arbitrariness in there because it's not easy necessarily to make sure you've captured every single result when you're going back 100 years or more. But probably, certainly in the post-war era, he's probably caught more of the results. So this gives you an example of Turkey's performance since the 1920s. And I put three things up here: how many games they played in each decade, what the win percentage was, and what percentage of those games were played against UEFA teams, with UEFA obviously being seen as the strongest association. And you see that from this that the first thing to note, of course, is the expansion of the number of games. So in the early years, the national team is playing relatively few games, but particularly in the post-war era, you see a very rapid expansion. So in the 1940s, only 12 games played, then rising to 40 games in the 50s, 60 games in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, then 90 in the 90s, and over 100, nearly 130 in the last decade. So you've seen this huge expansion in the quantity of international football played. And also you can see that the national team's results have been kind of up and down over time. It's noticeable in the 1940s, was something of a golden era for the national team in Turkey. But notice also that actually Turkey was playing relatively few games against stronger UEFA teams, mostly playing teams from a large or significant number of games were played against teams from the Asian Federation. However, you can also say that these are very, very small samples, so it's quite hard to draw many inferences about the strength of the team. But certainly, if we looked into the more recent period where the number of games it has increased, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the national team was winning typically less than 50% of the games that it's played. And that percentage rises quite sharply in the 90s and then in the first decade of the new millennium. So we've seen a strong improvement in the results of the national team. And so in some sense, Turkey has, as a national team, has got noticeably better, starting from a relatively weak base. And that's a story that might be true of quite a lot of countries that we look at in this database. So here's some data to show you just how much international soccer as a whole has grown. The left-hand scale shows you the number of games played per season and is represented by the red line, and the right-hand scale is the number of countries that are actually playing international football and is shown by the blue line. Of course, the point about these is the two things go pretty much hand in hand. What we've seen, this is starting in 1950, we've seen a huge expansion in the number of nations that play football, and we've seen a huge expansion in the number of games that get played. So in 1950, you have something like as few as 25, about 50 or so countries that are playing international football, and they're playing something like 250 games in a season. So it's a relatively small amount of football played by a relatively small number of teams. Whereas today we see something like 2,000 games played per season, so something almost a tenfold increase in the number of games played. Plus, we've seen a fourfold increase in the number of teams. We've gone from about 50 teams to 208, as I mentioned, although not all teams play in every season. So you see there's some variation. But clearly an enormous expansion in the amount of football that gets played. And if you look at this, this table shows you the distribution of those games by decade according to the association. So UEFA and CONMEBOL, that's Europe and South America. AFC, that's the Asian Federation. CAF, that's the African Federation. CONCACAF, that's the North American, Central American Association. And OFC, that's Oceania. And you can see that obviously at the beginning, when England plays Scotland, it's all European, so it's a bit anachronistic. There wasn't a UEFA then, but if there had been, it would have been under UEFA. And we see 100% of the games played in UEFA. And you can see over time the percentage of games played by UEFA teams has fallen to only 30%. We see in CONMEBOL, we see, of course, they don't start out playing international games because the game spreads from Europe, but in fact, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you see a pretty rapid increase in the number of games played in South America, and even in the 1940s, you see South America accounts for something like 25% of international teams competing, but that percentage has fallen gradually to being just about 6% in the last decade. Whereas then if you look at the Asian Federation, again, but all the other federations really don't get going seriously until after the Second World War. And you see the Asian Federation increasing and the African Federation increasing rapidly to the point where today they account for about a quarter of the teams each that are competing. And then finally the North Americans with sort of up and down, but now getting into the 14–15% bracket. So it shows you that you've got a lot more teams competing. So you've got new teams coming in and playing games, and often they're playing against teams which have far more experience than they do in playing international football, which is a sort of situation which generates the Zaire-Brazil game, where you have this huge difference between the teams, and some people attempted to denigrate the role of the lesser teams. And this is particularly noticeable for Africa, and in particular, I think one thing we sometimes forget about international development is how recent many countries are, that they just didn't exist as nations, as independent nations, until very recently. So here's a list of independent state for African countries. Of course, you have the outliers: Liberia, 1847, South Africa, 1910, but then again, not really the majority of South Africans. Egypt, 1922. Ethiopia in 1941, and really after that, pretty much all the African nations arrive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You've had a few since the 1970s, of course, have been added. The sort of final end of colonialism, but it's really the 60s, actually pretty much the 60s, in which most of these African nations become independent. And if you think about what happens when these nations become independent, I mean, one of the very first things they do is establish a national football team and create a national football stadium. That was something that pretty much all of these countries did, and it was clearly a very important part of demonstrating your status as a new nation is having a football team. So let me say something about the convergence in the origins of this idea of convergence, which actually comes from the economics literature and the convergence debate in economics. So the convergence argument goes something like this. Again, we can argue about that. We can talk about the growth of national income in the way that we can talk about soccer results. In fact, in football results, in fact, people talk about national income first. And the hypothesis goes like this. If you think about differences between nations, then some poorer nations are likely to have less productive capital. And what that means is that the returns on investing in productive capital, all else equal, should be higher in those countries. So that means that the poor countries are the ones that should grow faster because they have the better investment opportunities. So if capital is free to move across the world, then you'll see faster, greater investment and then faster growth in countries with relatively low incomes. And so, again, all else equal, as long as countries have similar access to technologies, we should see convergence in national income over time. And there was, in the early 90s, there were some famous papers written about this, particularly Robert Barrow, who later got the Nobel Prize. And they proposed a very simple test of this convergence hypothesis, and the simple test is to take is to look at the level of GDP in the past and relate that to changes in GDP today, and you should see an inverse relationship. So the lower the GDP was in the past, the bigger the positive change you should observe today. The larger was GDP in the past, the smaller the positive change, the smaller the rate of growth that you should observe. And of course, anecdotally, think about the stories we tell of the post-war world. At the end of the Second World War, the United States is the richest country on the planet. First, we have an economic miracle in Europe with the Renaissance of Germany and the German and France and economic growth there. Then we see an economic miracle in Japan. When Japan becomes a strong economy, we see an economic miracle in Korea. As they become a powerful economy, we see economic miracles in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and of course nowadays we talk about a Chinese economic miracle as these countries all grow and start to catch up with the United States. And we talk about this, or at least the popular press likes to talk about this in terms of miracles, but these are not miracles at all. This is simply investment. If you invest in capital and you give workers capital to work with, they become more productive. That's a fundamental story, the fundamentals of the neoclassical growth model, not a miracle at all, just simple investment, plain and simple investment. And in a sense, this convergence test relates to that very simple story of investment in capital. Well, one of the things that, one of the results of this story is, although anecdotally you can see that there's likely to be good support for convergence, and it's true, if you take a sample of just countries in Europe and Asia, for example, you see very strong evidence of convergence over the last 50 years. Africa has always been seen as something of an outlier in this story. So for whatever reasons, there seems to have been evidence that at least between the 1970s and the 1990s, Africa failed to grow rapidly, failed to converge rapidly towards the income levels that we see in the rest of the world. And indeed, actually, if we just the simple convergence relationship that you just relate growth rates to the historical level of GDP, there seems to be no statistical relationship whatever, which brings us to the notion of conditional convergence. So if we look at the relationship unconditionally, we don't take into account any idiosyncratic factors, we see no evidence of convergence. We only really start to see convergence when we start to take account of institutional factors. So obviously, for example, a very simple one would be, is your country been at war in the last 5 years? If you've been at war in the last 5 years, the likelihood that you're going to converge is going to be much lower than if you haven't been at war in the last 5 years. Have you had a civil war? Do you have a stable political system? These questions all seem to relate closely to the likelihood of convergence. And so you get to this idea of conditional convergence when you take account of all of these different factors. Now, there's a slight problem conceptually with kind of conditional convergence, because then you start to ask questions about, well, what's chicken and egg here? Is it that you need to get rid of the war in order to converge, in order to get the growth in GDP, or is it that the war arises because you didn't get the growth in GDP? And you have sort of problems statistically unwrapping this. So conditional convergence in itself seems like a rather problematic concept. Now, there's a very interesting paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics from a couple of years ago by Dani Roderick, where he actually found very strong evidence of unconditional convergence. So actually just looking at growth rates and looking at growth rates on past levels, but instead of looking at national GDP, he just looks at the output of individual productive plants. So he's looking at the company level, at the plant level of productivity of plants. And he finds that at these plants you find evidence of unconditional convergence. So wherever you have these manufacturing plants, you will find that they will tend to converge in terms of their productivity over time, and quite rapidly. And he tells a story of this based on the idea that when it comes to manufacturing plants, these businesses are engaged in global trade. They are benchmarking each other, they are benchmarking one against another all of the time. And so that they quickly have to learn how to reach the highest level of productivity. And the further behind you are in productivity today, the faster you're going to have to grow if you're going to survive. And of course, if you don't converge, then you just shut down, so you drop out of the data altogether. So in that sense, his story seems to make some sense in terms of why you might observe convergence under particular conditions. And so, which leads me to think that we might think about a similar story about football, and thinking about convergence, which is not at the level of the whole national economy, but at the level of a particular activity which is internationally competitive, and indeed where, in fact, arguably one of the most internationally competitive activities that there is. So let me go to the first way of looking at this problem, and looking at it from looking at the results, and taking just the results of individual, of averaging the results of teams from other federations against the established dominant federations of UEFA and CONMEBOL. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the results of all of the games between teams played from on the one side, either UEFA or CONMEBOL, against, on the other side, a team from any other federation, of which there are thousands of these games. I'm going to look at actually the three federations. And what I'm going to measure is, for these purposes, I'm going to look at win percentage. Now, of course, the outcome of a football match is a win, a loss, or a draw. So, in that sense, how do I, in order to measure win percentage, I have to account for draws somehow. And I adopt the convention which a lot of people adopt, which not totally unproblematic, but probably a reasonable approximation. I treat every draw as half a win. Okay. You can argue with that statistically later about whether that's valid, but it's not a bad approximation, I think. So these is teams from the Asian Federation against teams from Europe and South America. And this is probably the strongest argument you might have for some kind of convergence taking place. If you go back to, again, I start in 1960. Back in 1960, teams from the Asian Federation were achieving a win percentage against teams from Europe and South America in the region of 16–17%. So really, really lousy, very, very poor. And over this 52-year period, you see the results have risen quite dramatically to the point where they're now achieving a win percentage of 35%. Now I've measured this cumulatively. So in some sense, with every additional year, you have to carry the baggage of all the past years. So if you think about what that means, probably means they're actually doing very well in recent years, because they're actually achieving far better than 35% in recent years, because they're on this constant upward line. Now, you might see some slowing off of that upward progress in recent years, and of course it may well be that it gets harder to sustain this, particularly with this cumulative approach. Bear in mind, of course, back in the 1960s, they're hardly playing any games at all anyway. They only expanded the number of games dramatically in recent years. So that's Asia. Slightly not quite so powerful a story for Central and North America. You do see from the 1960s, you do see a sudden jump up in results as they improve. Again, still an era of relatively few games, so that just one or two games can make a big impact on this statistic. But nonetheless, since the 70s, really, there was a slight decline, but since the 70s, still a fairly continuous increase. Again, maybe you might say in the last 5 years, there's some evidence of a flattening off. And bear in mind, they're at below 40%. So they've still got a long way to climb up to the 50% level, but still taking the 60-year period, quite a lot of improvement. And then finally, Africa. Africa's difficult. And one of the reasons Africa's difficult is because in the early post-war years, there were very few games. Remember, there were very few African countries. Egypt was one of the few African countries that played games, and Egypt tended to play a lot of games against Malta. And now Malta's in UEFA, so you could say it's European, but frankly, you know, it's not exactly the most demanding opposition on the planet. So, no offense to any Maltese in the audience. I'm sure it's a perfectly good football team, but so in that sense, some of those early years of variation are a little bit problematic. But what you certainly can see is from about 1974, when the Brazil-Zaire game was playing, you've seen a fairly steady increase in African performance. And again, I don't know, so many of you may know the famous quote that Pelé made around the mid-70s when he said, by the year 2000, an African team will win the World Cup. That was a prediction that turned out not to be true, of course, and I think a lot of people would still say we're a way off from an African team winning the World Cup. So certainly African nations have struggled perhaps to arrive to the level of Europe and South America in recent years. Nonetheless, I would argue in the 70s and 80s, precisely the period when African economies were struggling to converge in economic terms, their GDP was lagging behind badly and not showing signs of growth, their football teams were doing noticeably better in terms of their result. So let me go on to my second way of looking at the question. So I'm going to look at the question of whether current performance and past performance, current performance is negatively correlated with past performance. So are the strong countries getting weak and the weak countries getting stronger? So what this exercise involves taking. I've broken the data up into 8-year cycles, so 2 World Cups essentially. And basically what I do is I say, well, let's take the average win percentage of a country over that 8-year cycle. And then let's compare changes from one 8-year cycle to the next and compare that to the previous level. So do we see teams that have a low 8-year average at the beginning, are they seeing faster growth in their win percentage than teams that have a high win percentage in the previous 8 years? And so here's the basic chart that you observe. So here, if you think on the horizontal axis, you have the win percentage in the previous 8-year cycle. And on the vertical axis, you have the change in win percentage. And so what you can see, and the line there is a regression line, and what I think you can see fairly clearly is that if you tended to have a high win percentage, so you were to the right of the chart in the previous 8-year cycle, you tend to be relatively low on the vertical axis. You tend to be at 0 or below in terms of your change in win percentage. Whereas if you tended to be low in terms of your win percentage in the previous 8-year cycle, so you're to the left of the chart, you tend to be relatively high up the vertical axis. You tend to have a relatively high growth in win percentage. And that's taking all of the countries across all of the cycles. So if you think I've got 7 or 8 cycles here from the 1950s up to 2010. So that looks like confirmation of this convergence going on in football results. And what I do in the paper is I think of lots of different ways of breaking up my sample in order to see whether this is true for subsamples. So in order to suggest, well, is this just an artifact of some differences between some countries? Is it being driven by particular factors? I try and test it in lots of different ways. So one thing I do is I don't just look at win percentage, I also look at goal difference. We used to see very weak countries being beaten by very large scores. So 10-1 was not an unusual score 30, 40 years ago. But it has become, in international football, a relatively rare score. It's quite unusual now for countries to lose by that kind of margin. So the first panel, the higher panel is the win percentage chart. The lower panels are the goal difference chart. So you can see here, so that was the one I just showed you before. Here now is the goal difference for all the countries. And again, what you can see is if the goal difference was very positive in the past, it tends to be relatively low, the change tends to be relatively small, but if the goal difference was very low, it tends to come down quite a lot on the vertical axis. So we tend to see convergence in the goal difference. And this might be an artifact of just looking at, as new countries come into the data, we might be seeing this as just being a very temporary effect for new countries. So in these charts, I look only at the countries that have been playing since my first cycle, since 1955. So I restrict it to a relatively small subsample, and I get the same convergence effect. Now your eyes might start to glaze over as I go over these charts because there's quite a lot more. So I'm going to just really run through them very quickly just to tell you what they are. I believe we can make the paper available somewhere if people are interested. So if you really want to read this stuff. So but you know, this is what economists have to do. We have to beat this thing over the head till it's dead to persuade you that the statistical relationship we're claiming really is there. So I look at one. I think this is quite interesting. If the left-hand panel is win percentage, and it's looking at each individual cycle. So it's looking. So 63 to 70 is one cycle, 71 to 78, and so on. And so as we go from left to right, we're coming more and more up to date. We go left and then go down to the bottom and then go along again. And one thing that's noticeable about this is that the relationship is getting flatter. In other words, the size of the relationship, the size of the convergence effect is getting smaller over time, which makes some sense in as much as in the early years you probably got a lot of countries having bad results who can improve themselves quite quickly by just taking on some basic rules of the game. And probably what's now the case is that it's actually quite hard to make improvements. So you don't lose by 10-1 anymore, but you're still losing 1 or 2-0. Yeah, it's proving harder to catch up. And that seems to be, to me, a coherent story, which seems to be present in the data, whichever way you look at it. And again, the right-hand panel is goal difference. This is just the same thing, just focusing only on those teams that were playing at the beginning of the first cycle. This is looking at games between different continents, just to check that it's not just that this is actually happening when teams come across against each other. So one thing might be that if you find you lose a lot against European teams, the answer is stop playing European teams. So then you might see some convergence in win percentage within continents, but then you won't see it between continents. This shows that you actually see it when you look at games between continents as well, so that it's not just a sort of a selection effect going on. So there's lots of different ways of cutting this up. So and there's more of this in the paper, and you can look at the estimates of the coefficients in more detail if that's what you're interested in. So it seems like there's looked at this way, there's evidence of convergence in the sense that the worse you were in the past, the better you tend to be today. the better you were in the past, relatively speaking, the worse you get. Now, within this convergence literature, there was quite a debate that went on in the late 90s about how you can interpret this. And one problem with this data is it isn't clear what it tells you about the underlying dispersion. So one possibility is that everybody is converging to the same level. But another possibility, which was described as twin peaks, is the idea that you've got kind of a bimodal distribution and people are converging to one of these two, one of two peaks, and in which case it's less, there isn't really underlying convergence in the data. So some people argued that really what you should be looking at is not this relationship between current growth and past levels, but actually you should just look at the dispersion and see whether there's convergence in the dispersion. So that's what I look at here is, let's just look at the dispersion of results between teams. And these are estimates of the dispersion of results, looking at win percentage over 6 of my 8-year cycles. And so my view of this is that you can see this if you look at it. You certainly, if you spend enough time looking at this, you can see very clearly that what's happening is if you go back to the earliest period of the top left-hand corner, the distribution is fatter and less tall. And if you look at the right hand, at the bottom right-hand corner, the distribution has got thinner and taller. And they're all to the same scale, so you can actually see, if you just look at the numbers, that that's actually the case. In the paper, I have some proper statistical tests to show that it is indeed the case that these dispersions are getting are diminishing over time. And so we can see a decline in the dispersion. That's for win percentage, and this is the dispersion of goal differences, again, for teams over this time. And again, we see the same thing over time. These dispersions are diminishing, and we're seeing more concentration in the results. And so this evidence also seems to suggest that there's convergence going on in football, and that this process has been a continuing process over time. So much of what I've said really is to try to persuade you that there is evidence there that convergence is taking place, because that's really the important story, because then the question is, well, why would we see convergence for the results of national football teams when we have, and this is, again, to stress, this is unconditional convergence. I'm not controlling for any other factors, so I'm not trying to explain away why I'm not getting convergence. I'm getting convergence in the simplest way, rather in the way that Dani Rodrik is getting convergence for his manufacturing plants. And I think the similar kinds of stories apply to my research as would apply to his research. So why is there, so my question, why is such strong evidence of convergence when evidence for convergence of GDP is relatively weak? So I can think of at least 4 stories here, which I think are all interesting stories about the differences between football and national economies. Of course, it's kind of absurd to suggest that football and national economies would be the same anyway. But it is actually interesting to think about what are the different processes. So one thing is, the football is a relatively simple process. You know exactly what you have to do, and it's relatively objective. I mean, we can all complain about the time our team played and should have won, but the referee cheated, or somebody dived, or something. But the bottom line is, you know what the result was, and you know what you have to do to win. And so, moreover, there's plenty of scope for learning about this because you can see what people do. There are very few tactics that you can adopt in football that other people can't learn to copy, and learn to copy quite easily. So that means that these processes can spread, and the weak teams can quickly get better because they can imitate. Probably the problem in many economies is learning those things that make an economy productive is relatively difficult. After all, economists definitely don't agree about what makes an economy more productive. There's a lot of controversy about this. And you can see that, for example, in the debates we have today about, for example, is the Washington consensus a good thing or a bad thing? There's now something called the Beijing consensus, which has a different set of prescriptions for running a national economy, and these two are in some sense in conflict with each other. We have these difficulties in economics of deciding of how countries that are behind can learn from countries that are ahead. What is it that you're trying to learn? And lots of debates on that scale. So learning is hard. For national economies, but not so much for football. The other thing I think that's interesting is the mobility of the players. One of the problems with catching up in GDP is the whole story is a story of investment. And the problem with investment is always appropriability. How do I ensure that I get the benefits of the return on the investment that I make? And in lots of countries, it's really hard to make sure that that happens. And many people believe that's really one of the major problems behind convergence. That in some sense, the countries that enable you to appropriate your returns are the ones that give you the incentives to invest. Those are the ones that converge. And the countries that don't, for whatever reason, enable you to appropriate returns, they're the ones that fail to converge. But then you get into the whole problem of appropriability, which gets into the whole question of social justice, which gets you into lots of deep water and lots of disagreement about what works. Football players, I would argue, they are largely able to appropriate their returns. I don't even remember the famous case of, I think it was the 2006 World Cup, when the Togo players were actually had their, the Togo Football Federation wouldn't pay the players the money. Basically, the officials who run the federation had stolen the money and passed it around to their friends and relations, and the football players weren't getting anything. And the Togo players actually refused to participate anymore in the World Cup until FIFA came in and said, you know what, we'll give you your money. And the Togo players went back to play. So in that sense, the players have some leverage whenever it comes to negotiation about their returns, because they can always not play. And the thing about football is everybody wants to see the players play, and there aren't good substitutes for the top players. So in that sense, it's relatively easy for the players to appropriate their returns. And indeed, the players are internationally mobile, so they can go and actually get the returns on their playing per clubs internationally, and many African players become incredibly rich. And almost every African player who succeeded has actually gone back and created some kind of an academy in their country. They may not even spend very much time in their home country, but again, it's a good business to set up an academy in your name because you're so famous, and you could feed players to football clubs. In that way, you can appropriate returns. Politicians can rip off almost anybody except star footballers. Really hard to do that, because they're just, people like them too much. They're our heroes and our stars. And so that may be one reason why in football, then if you can appropriate the returns, you're willing to invest in learning. The players will do whatever it takes to become successful because they know they will keep the returns. If you told the vast majority of footballers, you know what, you will see no return even if you become the biggest star on the planet, I think a lot of people wouldn't bother so much. I mean, they still play football, but they wouldn't bother becoming the best because they know they wouldn't get the benefit of it. I think those are kind of sort of supply side stories about investment, and which is sort of are popular with a lot of growth theorists about, you know, what causes growth to happen. I think a different story is the story which I think is. Story about which is to the credit of FIFA as an organization. Now, FIFA is an organization that comes in for a lot of criticism about many of the things it does. And indeed, I guess I'm on record as saying some unkind things about FIFA. So it's nice to be able sometimes to balance that out by saying that they've done some good things. And I think FIFA has done some very important things in terms of spreading the access to international football for developing nations. FIFA had an explicit policy of extending places to particularly African and Asian nations, at a time when, strictly on sporting merit, they wouldn't have qualified. Hence the Zaire example at the beginning, really. There were lots of teams in Europe that would have done better than Zaire. However, FIFA wanted to develop the game in Africa. We can argue about whether their motives were Simon pure in this, perhaps not. But nonetheless, that was a progressive move on their part. By creating more demand for African teams, they gave African teams the opportunity to develop. Again, you think about international development and growth of GDP. Well, most countries have aid budgets, most developed countries have aid budgets, but most of those aid budgets seem to go on defense equipment and actually on production taking place in the home, in the nation of the aid giver. They seem to be job creations in the giving nation rather than really creating jobs in the developing nation. So in some sense, you know, there's maybe a lesson there about how stimulating demand internationally can make a big difference. And then finally, I think, which comes back to something I said at the beginning, the first thing that all of these nations did was create a national football team and build a national stadium. In some sense, in the early days, the status of football was so high and the importance of football was so high because it was an important indicator, an important measure of national independence. Now, in some ways, that might explain what's been happening in more recent years. Perhaps the African nations have struggled more recently to improve results, partly because in those early years they had the government basically took over the national economy and diverted resources into the things that they thought were important. Maybe a lot of money was going on the national football team when money could have been going into other like education, investment, and so on. And what's happened more recently in the 90s under pressure from organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, African nations have stepped back their government investment, government control of the economy. And some people have argued that this has been detrimental to the development of football in these nations as well. That there isn't the provision of facilities. So, for example, things like playing football in schools has been downplayed, the provision of facilities, government construction of playing fields, for example, those kind of activities have diminished under the pressure to devote resources to what are claimed to be more productive activities. I think there's some interesting research to be done on that. I think it's just a speculation on my part here, but I think what this shows is there are multiple potential explanations for these phenomena, and this is not a story which is yet finished. My own view, I guess, would be that ultimately, I think results will converge yet further, and I think, but that may take some time, and there are, just as there are difficulties and challenges in the convergence of GDP across the world, there are difficulties and challenges in the convergence of football results too. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. I think we have time for questions, comments.
Thank you for this very insightful presentation. My name is Alpayat and I'm a lecturer at Boğaziçi University. My question would be about the role of geography and distance, physical distance. And now, if you look at Europe, you know, it's a small continent with a lot of countries, 50 countries, and you can play many matches, you can organize tournaments at low cost, high revenues, and even at the youth level you can have many competitions, many matches, and so on. And I think Africa is a similar story. Africa is of course bigger, but again many countries and are close to each other. You can have a very nice, very well organized African championship. But if you look at the other regions of the world, you can can see places where this is not the case. And I'm mainly talking about Oceania in this respect. Now, if you look at the competitions there, and I had the opportunity to see it firsthand because I used to live there for a while, and you can't play that many games because the countries are so far from each other, and the distances are big, so everything is more costly. And then what happens is you can't play enough, and you can't get publicity, you can't improve, you can't get sponsorship deals, and this is a vicious circle. So you get stuck where you are, and you can't improve, no convergence. I think Australia has broken this circle because they are now in the Asian competition, but for the others, there's this. I think there's this serious situation. The question is, would you agree, or do you think that geography and distance can doom some countries to failure or to an impossibility or low probability of convergence? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and you raised an important point, which actually, when I first started this research, to be honest with you, I didn't expect to find unconditional convergence. Because one of the things I started with, and again, if you've read Soconomics, one of the things we say in the book is that at least 3 factors matter in determining national football team results. You'd expect the size of the population. So the bigger the population, you need people at the top end of the distribution. The more likely you are to have people at the top end of the distribution if you have a bigger population on which to draw. Secondly would be income. You'd think you need quite a lot of investment in facilities and training and youth training in order to develop football teams. So you think GDP would be an important factor in conditioning the level of results that you can achieve. And the third one would be experience. You'd think experience would matter. If you've been doing this a long time, it's going to be a lot easier than if you only just started. So I thought that what I would find is, I'd find, like the GDP literature, I thought I'd find no evidence of unconditional convergence, but conditionally, once I control for those factors, then I'd see convergence. What kind of derailed me in that research was actually, no, I mean, it's just actually you can see unconditional convergence in the data. You don't, even without controlling for those factors. They ought to matter, and I think you add another one there, geography, which distance ought to be very important in determining the results. The fact of the matter is, though, at this level, it's actually hard to see those factors making a difference. Now, maybe as you go forward in time, maybe as this catch-up happens, maybe, and then remember the relationship was getting flatter, maybe it's going to become harder and harder, and then these conditional factors will become more and more important. So I think that might be true in the future, but what struck me about the data was, in the last 60 years, it seems to be an unconditional event, which surprised me, to be honest.
Anıl Gökçen Körpınar, İDA Capital. I have one comment and one question. The comment is Pele was right, because there is one team, African team, we call them France. And the question is, how do you see the role of local federations, governance, or local countries' regulations in this convergence game?
Right.
Because I had a chance to meet with Sean Hamill from University of Birkbeck, and he had a very nice presentation at that day, and he stated, he explained all the countries, the governance models, but at the end he said that if the regulation isn't on the scene, then you can't do anything with the governance only. In order to have a decent win, you have to have a regulation first. So how do you see?
So Sean is a very old friend of mine, and so we have stood on platforms and argued with each other. I think that's the only way to put it, for many years. And I think he won't mind me saying that he's not a data man. So So Sean comes to this with that view that we need proper regulation, and a proper regulation is a sine qua non for having any kind of progress. To which I would say the data just doesn't agree with that. That's just not true. And we see plenty of examples here of teams getting better regardless of their governance structure. Now again, I think it goes back to the previous point. I think maybe in the longer term, maybe it does matter, maybe it is significant, and it could one day come to play a role, but I think right now, I don't think it matters that much.
Hi, this is Serdar Alemdar. My question about the effect of mobility of the coaches, European or South American coaches towards developing football countries. Is that variable, is a moderating effect on this convergence? Did you have a chance to look at this effect?
No, I haven't looked at that. It's a very nice point, and I think maybe I should have said that in my conclusion. I think that's another effect that that might explain why we see this convergence. So I phrased it in terms of the international players from Africa being able freely to move abroad and learn the trade in Europe or South America or wherever it might be, and then bring those skills back to their national team. But I could equally, I think your point is equally say, well, the fact that the European or South American coaches can equally move to Africa or Asia and bring their skills and their knowledge to those countries, I think that's a very important driving factor in creating this kind of convergence. And I think it's very noticeable. So again, if you think about the economics, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the British government tried to stop engineers leaving the country as a way of preventing other countries from catching up. And the problem was it didn't work, that the engineers just went anyway because they were offered enough money. They said, well, we'll take the risk of your anger. And I think that's when, in the modern context, I think you see the coaches moving internationally for precisely that reason. Another country will offer them a high wage to go and bring their skills. And you see that. You can think of plenty of examples. You can think of the example, I mean, Australia is one good example. South Korea is another good example. I mean, same person, yeah. So now I think, okay, can we think of other examples? But you probably think of good examples with other people as well, right?
Hi, I know that you have intentionally isolated the national teams and national football, but I believe the asymmetry between national and club teams, and I mean by that, 50 years ago maybe national teams were the heart of football, but today the club football is more popular and more improved. And this asymmetry shows itself maybe best in England. They have probably the best league, Premier League. But their national team has been suffering. And
what are you telling me? I'm an Englishman.
about that. How do you interpret this? African players playing in Europe,
right?
In clubs.
Well, one of the I suppose what I mean, so I don't think there should be any correlation between the national team performance and the standard of the National League in the long term. I think they should be more or less independent, because effectively, in a free market, the players will just go to wherever they're most valued. That's independent of their nationality. And in reality, I think that's what we more or less see. We see players move to wherever they're most valued. Now, I think there is some inertia here. I mean, one of the things about So to talk about my own pains as an Englishman, one of the problems with my country is English people are not good travelers on the whole. They haven't been, or English footballers, they haven't really gone to ply their trade internationally, so they haven't learned from foreign countries. And what's happened since the arrival of foreign players in England is England has got better. If you look at the results over the last 20 years, the national team, they're significantly better than the previous 20 years. So however bad you think England are now, it was even worse before. And I speak with great knowledge because that's when I was growing up. And it was much worse to be an Englishman 30 years ago than it is today. So we're still not a great team. You know, we get to the last 16 of the quarterfinals. But we are learning, I think, from international players. And I think that's, in a sense, if you got rid of the market for players at the club level, this very competitive market, the problem, then you might see more inertia of the national teams, because that would slow down the process of learning. What ensures the learning is not what happens to the national team, it's actually what happens to the players representing clubs across the world.
Emir Güney from Kadir Has University Sports Studies Research Center. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I would like to ask a question on your data set. You compare the UEFA and CONMEBOL teams against all other continents, and the only cases these international matches can be played is World Cups, Olympic Games, and friendlies, right? Right. So my question is, you know, there are quotas for the World Cup, FIFA World Cup, for the continents. For example, I think around 13 teams can enter from UEFA, but only half a team can come from Oceania. Mm-hmm. If so, this is not, maybe this is a competitive advantage for the European national teams, maybe. But if we think that all the continents have the same quotas, how would you think your statistics would change? So now the only best teams from some continents can play with many other teams from, for example, UEFA and CONMEBOL. So does this change?
So what do you mean by the same quota? You mean Oceania would have as many teams as UEFA?
Yes. It's not the ideal world, I know, but in respect of representation from a continent to other.
Well, you know the way that right now, if a player is from a small country, it's often the case that he finds a way to find nationality of a bigger country that will compete so he can go to the World Cup. I think you'd find a lot of Europeans trying to find relatives in Tahiti so that they could play for an Oceania team. I mean, you know, one question is, what would be proportional? I mean, the idea that all the federations should have the same number of teams seems to me to be, that's not proportional at all. So, but I mean, could it be proportional to population? Or, I mean, traditionally what's happened is that FIFA has allocated places disproportionately to capabilities. So I would argue that if we just had a competition between European teams and, particularly take CONCACAF, I think the European teams would win almost all the games. The United States would not get to play in the World Cup if we was just on ability, to be honest with you. I just don't think they would. Sorry, and sorry to my employers and to many Americans who are now, if the Americans hear this, they will scream and shout and be very upset about this. But I just don't think they would. But I think that, but obviously FIFA wants the United States to be there, and they want to encourage the development of football. In the past, they did the same thing with Africa. You might argue about whether it's still disproportionate for Africa and for Asia. But I think that's what they've encouraged, and I think that's been a good thing for the development of football. I think the question in the longer term I think we probably end up with the plan of having too many good football teams, and we're going to have difficulties organising competitive structures in the future. But also, I think there's a rivalry between, obviously, club football is if anything, is the more powerful version of the game, the more popular version of the game. We might see a challenge to so many national team games being played anyway. The question is, what's the relative appetite for club football as opposed to national team football? And actually, I think in the long term, there's a greater appetite for the club version of the game than for the national team version of the game. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it sort of does, but not quite, I think.
Professor, I would like to congratulate you on a wonderful lecture. Now, I'm coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a country which will be participating this year for the first time in the World Cup. And I would like to narrow this talk a bit down. I would not like to take anything away from your wonderful speech, but me coming from a management background, I would like to know what in particular can a country or a football association of the country do in order to enhance its chances or perspective of winning more against the better teams and going to, respectively, the World Cups or the European Cups of this planet?
Legally or illegally?
Legally, of course.
Oh, legally.
Well, or both ways. I mean, it can be a ways analyzed if you have any.
No, maybe I shouldn't give advice on illegal ways to win more often. Although, obviously, that's obviously a big issue in football nowadays. Is, you know, the whole match fixing issue is getting bigger and bigger, and that's one of the problems that have arisen with just the sheer number of international teams there are. And in many ways, you know, a problem is a lot of these international games are not seen as being very meaningful, and that's one of the problems. But I guess the issue one question is, so for a country like Bosnia-Herzegovina, I mean, the fundamental problem is with a very small population, it's going to be difficult to be globally competitive. So the way to compensate for that is to make everybody play football. So if you make it a national law that you're not allowed to do anything other than play football, all other competitive sports are banned, that would be one way. You know, you get more people playing the game, so that to compensate for the lack of any advantage. And of course, I think openness is also, you want to encourage as many of your footballers to go abroad as possibly can, which is the opposite of what people normally say. So people normally say, English people say, we should get rid of all these foreigners in the Premier League and we'd have a better national team, which is rubbish. Our national team got better when we brought foreigners in. Likewise, you see people from other countries saying, oh, our best footballers shouldn't go abroad to play, they should stay at home, and then our national team will get better. That's also rubbish. You want your best players to go and play in the highest level of competition that they can, and if that is not in your country, then you want them to leave your country and then bring that back and get better results. So there are some things you can do, but and I think that, you know, usually it's more about giving people the freedom to do what they want than it is imposing rules and regulations. And that's where I really part company with Sean Hamill. He wants to regulate everyone and tell them what to do. I actually think most of us do better if we're given the freedom to make our own choices. And I'm sure Bosnia-Herzegovina will do very well this year, right?
Hello, my name is Furkan. I am from Anadolu Agency. So, after all this convergence going on, do we expect a surprise in the next World Cup?
Well, do we expect a surprise? It would be a surprise to me. I have no idea who's going to win. So, I mean, I mean, one of the puzzles, obviously, about this is, although there's clear evidence here of weaker teams getting better, there's also the obvious fact that the winners of the World Cup have been drawn from a very small sample. So, and when we get to the quarterfinals, if we don't see Brazil, Argentina, Germany, Italy, Spain, we'd all be astonished, right? And it still remains very hard. But I think this hold is going to be broken eventually. Maybe not this World Cup, but I think it's going to come because of this learning process. But I don't have a good answer of making any outlandish predictions. I'm sure Bosnia-Herzegovina will do better than anyone expects, but how will it? I don't think it'll win it.
Hi, I'm Engin Kayali from League TV, and my question is, should we understand from convergence that if given the same resources to all the nations, the international teams will perform more or less in the same growth as the other ones? If that's the case, how should we incorporate talent into this equation? Because what we are talking actually is the 25 or 30 top players for each country other than the country on itself. And I think the huge reason for this is that the players are going abroad in the very early ages, like 12 and 13, mostly Europe, and they get more or less the same education from there on, depending on their talent, of course.
Right. Well, I think one of the things is that, I mean, I think there's a lot of pessimism about international football and saying, you know, the small countries can never compete with the big countries. And I think what this data says is there's very little evidence to support that there's an enormous amount of potential for weak countries to get stronger. And that has actually been going on. Now, whether weak countries can go all the way and win a World Cup, I think we're still a while away from that. But I think that will come. So, and I think again, well, as I was trying to suggest, I think you should attribute that to the international mobility at the club level. And I think people should embrace that as a positive, not as a negative. And I think that what worries me is that there seems to be this kind of regulatory movement that says every club should have the same amount of resources, all the players should play in their national leagues, there should be very little international mobility. And I find that a very kind of scary vision of the world. But it's certainly one that attracts quite a lot of popularity amongst some people. So I think we need to beware what's going on.
Hello, do you have any specific recommendations about Turkey? You know, Turkey is crazy about football, and but it seems to be that this craziness and this popularity does not converge into big results. Only at 2002 World Cup final, and Galatasaray won the 3rd Cup of Europe. You know, just some successes every 5 or 6 years, just by coincidence or by just catching some young generations. But we don't see any structures, infrastructure to train. You know, most of the Turkish players who were successful in the teams were trained in Germany. They were born and grew up in Germany from the past generation that got successful with the national team. What is your general recommendation to have this passion converting into institutional success at club level and national team level? Right.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things you need to learn is the pain of the Englishman, right? So, you know, we think of ourselves as having invented this game, and we never win anything, so why should you? I mean, the fact is there's only going to be one world champion and there are 208 nations. It's that your chances of ever winning anything are really rather small. That is just the nature of the game that we're all passionate about and we all love to watch. Having said that, I mean, there's a lot that Turkey can do to improve the general level of football played in the country. I think, obviously there's a lot of investment in training. You have to learn from the best practice of foreign countries. I'm sure if you looked at it, I'm sure there's a lot of evidence of best practices coming from, especially from Germany, being adopted inside Turkey, and those contributing to the improved performance, not just of the national team, but of the club teams. I think you have to invest in, you want to invest in the training and development of young players. You want a larger pool of young kids playing the game, so you have more to choose from as the players come up. You want to maintain a competitive league, and you want all of these things. I mean, I think most of the things you can do probably are already going on. I mean, as long as one remembers that you have to learn from other people, and that you can never rest on your laurels. I mean, it's really hard to sustain success over a very long period of time. And as I showed at the beginning, Turkey has actually improved significantly in the last 30 years. And I think my guess is that that improvement will continue, precisely because you are so incredibly passionate about the game in this country. And that's an important driver, I think.
Okay, I think on that positive note, thank you very much for coming. We hope to discuss sports on this campus more often. And we thank Professor Syzmanski for this.